Alright, yeah, I have another fun project for you this week. This 60 headboard has a few damaged parts, but overall it's not a bad piece. Headboards don't sell well in my area though, so I decided to convert this into a console. My plan is to remove the bottom half and do a custom wood base. Usually the doors just pop out, but it seems like they built in these sliding doors. So I needed to take the frame apart. The bottom half was pretty easy to remove. I just had to unscrew a few parts and loosen up the areas where they glued it in place. Once I removed the bottom portion, I hammered the backing off, then flipped the piece to its front so I could remove the bottom part of the frame, which I ended up having to hammer that part off as well because it was nailed in place. I placed the bottom upwards to hammer the nails through. This will allow me to easily remove them from the other side. I wanted to remove the dividers so it would make it easier to sand everything. But before I could do that, I had to remove those little wood connectors that supported the sides to the top. The dividers were stapled through the back, but hitting it with my mallet did the trick to remove them. My chisel seemed to do the trick to remove the damaged veneer. I'm planning to replace it with some leftover mahogany veneer from a previous project. But before I did that, I sanded the old finish off. I started with 60 grit to roughen up the blonde finish, then followed up with 80 grit and 120 grit. I sanded the edge smooth, patched any seams and dents, and then waited for the wood filler to dry, then sanded that smooth. I measure out the new veneer to size and clean off any dust. I added glue to the back of the veneer and to the edge of the frame. I placed them together and then added tape to secure the veneer in place until I was ready to clamp it. I realized that I only had one clamp that was long enough to reach from end to end. So I grabbed some scrap pieces of plywood and a strap to add pressure that's needed for the veneer. But I did end up using that one clamp though. I waited until the end of the day to unclamp everything and to remove the tape. I used my handheld profile scraper to cut off any excess veneer and hand sanded the remaining excess. I like to hand sand this part because I feel like it gives me more control over what I want to remove or keep. I followed up with 220 grit to get a smooth and flat finish. I ended up patching a few areas that needed to be addressed and sanded it smooth. Finally, it's time to start painting. Like always, I sprayed 2 coats of primer, then sprayed 2 coats of Tortuga by PBG in the Breakthrough collection. And to just be honest with you guys, the reason why I chose this color was because of its name. It reminded me of the Pirates of the Caribbean, and I just fell in love. but this is my first time using this line, and I have to say that I'm pretty impressed. It dries super fast, sprays smoothly, and self-levels quite well. I will for sure be using this line again. Before I did a third coat, I wanted to start connecting the frame back together. Sorry for the lack of footage for this part. I realized my phone said my storage was full and wasn't recording during this time. But I pretty much did the same steps from when I was separating everything except for in reverse. I sprayed 2 coats on the top, then sprayed everything together on the third coat. I did follow it up with 2 coats of polyacrylic afterwards though. Okay, now it's time for the fun part. I figured that it would be easier for you to understand if I showed you the whole base design at once. This part was showing you how I was making my apron template. I really just play around until I like the design, but these clips shows the final results. So I went 7 inches in because that's where I wanted my apron curve to stop, and 2 inches up from where the foot meets the apron. I lined up my curvy ruler to each point and traced along it. This template doesn't need to be super big or long because I just needed it for each end of my apron. I took it to my bandsaw to start cutting out the design. I get as close as possible to where I trace and would sand any areas to shape if needed, which I did off camera. Same thing goes for the foot template. I marked out how long I wanted the foot to be, which I believe it was 26 inches long. Then marked out 2 inches for the part where the foot meets the apron. I used my curvy rulers again to trace out the curved part on the inner part of the foot. Then used my angle ruler to line up along the curve so I could trace out a long line. I didn't follow a certain degree for this one, I just lined it up until it looked right. I started with a 90-degree angle for the outer part of the foot, but ended up deciding to go with a 91-degree angle because I didn't like how big the foot was looking at the top. Then I lined up my curvy ruler again to each point to trace it out. Once I was happy with how it looked, I went to my bandsaw and cut out the template. I do want to tell you though that I did not cut out the curved part of the outer side. I will show you why in the next few steps. And this is how the templates turn out. I will put the measurements on the screen for you to refer back to. Alright, so I purchased a 12-foot slab of red oak at my local lumberyard for $34. I cut it down while I was there so it could fit in my truck. I set my table saw to 3 9/16 of an inch to cut the front and back aprons. The reason why I set it at that is because I want to use the whole width of this board and cutting it in half wasn't going to cut it. Afterwards, I grabbed my template to line it up to the bottom of the oak so I could trace out the design onto each end. I cut the excess off with my bandsaw, making sure to get super close to the line but not right on it. This is because you'll use your template and your router to do the final cuts. And here's a up-close look so you can see how close I got to that line. You will repeat the same steps with the foot template. I made sure to trace it side by side so I didn't waste any parts of the oak. I will be using the other half of the oak for the side aprons. So I traced out where I needed to cut that part off with my miter saw. If you have a sliding miter saw, then you could do this in one pass. But if you have a standard one like I do, then all you need to do is flip the piece to cut each part. I used my bandsaw to roughly cut out the 4 feet. I placed certain parts of the foot closely together, so I couldn't use my table saw to cut out the long parts. Plus, none of this was at a 90-degree angle or a straight edge, so it wouldn't work out that way anyways. Now it's time to start running out the final cuts. I have my 4 legs, double-sided tape, scissors, and my DeWalt router. I will be using 2 router bits, which is just a top bearing and bottom bearing flush bit. I cut my double-sided tape and placed it on my template. I ended up using less tape for the other feet because I didn't really need this much. Afterwards, I lined up the template on the oak where I traced it out. I pressed the pieces firmly together so it wouldn't budge. I placed my router on top of the template and used the bit where the bearing meets the template. That will act like a guide for my router so we'll only cut off the excess that we didn't need. After rounding that side, I used my scraper to remove the template from the oak. And this is what we're working with right now. I repeated those same steps for the aprons. Then I will flip the pieces over and switch out my flesh bit to route the other side. I wanted to show you a clip of me going through the process of rounding from above. I don't clamp the foot down to route, just holding it in place would do the trick. But here's an up close look of the router in action. Now that every piece is routed to size, it's time to start connecting them together. I wanted where the foot and the apron meet to look as seamless as possible. So I decided to do the dowel method. Luckily, I dropped and broke the dowel jig that I already owned. I stopped using it for a minute because I felt like it left too much room for error. So I purchased a better one from Rockler, and I'm happy to say that I like this jig way better. I placed the foot and the apron together where it's going to be connected at. Then I drew a line so I knew where to place my jig. Now keep in mind that this line won't be straight because the foot is at a 91-degree angle. I just made sure my jig was up against the starting point on each end. Okay, so this is why I like this jig way better. I'm actually able to see my line after clamping it, so I know I will be getting the right position every time. I applied glue in the holes and the surrounding area of the foot. Then hammer the dowels into the holes and apply glue to the end of the apron. Oh, I also labeled the end so I know I'm connecting the right parts. I insert the dowels into the holes and try to hammer them together, which I wasn't successful. Look, this base was 5 feet wide, which is nearly as tall as me, and I couldn't hammer down enough pressure. But that's not a problem because I needed to clamp it together anyways. By the way, this part right here is why I didn't cut that curve on the template, because I don't have any tools to clamp curves like that. I cleaned off any excess glue and clamped the base down to the table as well. While the foot was all clamped together and drying, I cut the curve detail to the foot template. At the end of the day, I unclamped the base and traced out the curve on the oak. I scooted the base to the edge and clamped it down so I could do a rough cut of the curve with my jigsaw. And let's just say that idea didn't quite work out well for me. So off to my bandsaw we go. It was a little tricky to try and hold the base up while cutting it, but it did what I needed to do. Afterwards, I repeated the same steps with my flesh bits. Okay, so do you remember when I told you that I was happy when I broke my old dowel jig? Well, this is what I mean about when it gave me too much room for error. The other 3 feet were perfect though, and I just ended up sanding it smooth and flush. You can leave your base like that, but I always love to add some routed details to my bases. So I will be using these bits. I'm using the 45-degree chamfer bit on the inside of the base. I routed off just a little bit at first, then went back over it just to give it more of a dramatic look. I then used my round over bit to round over the outside of the base. I ended up rounding over the front and the back part of both bases. Once I was finished rounding, I sanded everything smooth with my surf press sander. I started with 80 grit, then worked my way up to 220 grit. Since the front and back parts are done, I started focusing on the side aprons. This piece isn't too deep, so I didn't need a lot of wood for this. I believe each side apron was about 6.5 inches long. I decided to cut each one to 1 3/4 inches high. I cut a total of 4 side aprons. I sanded everything all smooth. I used 80, 120, 180, and 220 grit for this. I ended up doing pocket holes to connect the sides to the front and the back. I just thought it would be faster and easier to do it this way. I glued all 4 side aprons in place at once, so it will allow the glue to set up before I clamped it. Clamping it will help keep it secured until I was ready to drill it in place. Once I had those parts secured, I repeated the same steps for the other half of the base. By the way, I placed the lower side aprons about 8 inches up from the bottom. I just thought it looked best at that height. And this is what it looks like when I had it all clamped together. I left it all clamped like this overnight. The next day I used this handy tool to drill in the remaining screws. I'll link this and all the other items in the description. I still wanted a seamless look though, so I glued down some of these plugs in each of the pocket holes. I made sure to add extra glue so I could put the wood dust along the seams so there wouldn't be any gaps. While I waited for that to dry, I decided to add adjustable feet, just for an added foot design, but it was super easy to do. I just used an 11/16 drill bit to drill half of an inch deep. Then I hammered in the plaster part and screwed in the metal slider in place. When the plugs were fully dry, I sanded them down until they were flush and smooth. I added more glue and wood dust to any parts that needed it and will sand that smooth once it dried. There's plenty of different options that you could do to connect bases to a frame, but I opted for the 8-figure method because I figured that would give me the cleanest look and they're really good for wood movement. I just used my Forstner bit to drill into the wood so the figure 8 would be flush. Then I pre-drilled a hole for the screws and screw it in place. I wanted the base to still have a light wood look to it, and since this is red oak, I put 1 coat of pickle oak by Midwax over it. This will cancel out any of the red. I also sprayed 2 coats of polyacrylic off camera. Finally, I attached the base onto the frame, and here's a reminder of what it looked like before. And this is the final results. This may be my favorite base design to date. I just love the curved details, the mid-century vibes, and that I was able to repurpose an unwanted piece. Okay, now let's talk about the numbers. This was a free piece. I paid $34 on red oak, $6 on paint, and about $15 worth of materials that I've already had on hand. I ended up selling this for $400 to a repeat client, leaving my profit to be $345. I was working on this in between projects, so I did not time myself on this one, but I'm kind of kicking myself in the butt because I know I could have sold this for more. If you enjoyed this video, then go ahead and let me know by giving me a like down below, and if you want to see more furniture transformations or base builds, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Okay, you know the drill. Stay tuned for the next one.